This is your Red Church Door sermon from Sunday, February 24th, 2019, the seventh Sunday after the Epiphany, from the Reverend J. MacLeod. This sermon was shared with the people of St. Andrew's Episcopal Church in New London, New Hampshire.
Our story from the Hebrew Scriptures, that of Joseph, is one of the most poignant moments in all of Scripture. And of course, most of you will know the backstory, but we need to remember just what has led up to this moment. Joseph, of course, has 11 brothers. 10 of them despise Joseph. Why? Because his dad, Jacob, favored Joseph. He didn't make any secret that Joseph was his favorite. Not only that, Joseph would tattletale on his brothers, and he would lord it over them. He would recount dreams he had where all his brothers were bowing down to him, and recount them with, utter ignorance about the effect this would have on his brothers. His dad favored him, gave him that famous coat, the long-sleeve coat of many colors. And so his brothers despised Joseph, or at least his 10 older brothers. And so when they're out one day tending their flocks, they don't come back when they're expected. And Joseph's dad said, "Can you just go out and find them?" And when Joseph's brothers see Joseph coming in the distance, they say, "This is our chance. Finally, we can get rid of him." And they throw him in a pit. There's no way out. There's no bread and water. And one of them suggests, we should let him die. We might as well get something for him. And so they sell him to travelers coming from Jordan, actually, on their way to Egypt. And so off Joseph goes, sold into slavery by his own brothers. And of course, the story gets better. It gets more complex. Joseph has all sorts of adventures. He ends up, he's got the golden touch. Everything that Joseph touches prospers. He spends time in prison. He's accused of a capital offense that he didn't commit, but eventually is made viceroy to Pharaoh. He's number 2 in charge of all of Egypt because he interprets Pharaoh's dream and says, "This dream you have, what it means is there's going to be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years where the crops utterly fail and the whole world will be in famine. So what you need to do is set aside loads of your crops during the 7 good years so that you will have them stored up." And of course, that's what happens. And Joseph's in charge of the whole thing. Now, back in Canaan, back in Israel, back in Palestine, they're suffering from the famine along with everybody else. So finally, Jacob says to his sons, "You're going to have to go up to Egypt. They've got food there, and you're going to have to bring it back because otherwise we are all going to starve." And so that's what Joseph's brothers do. They set out, they arrive in Egypt. And who is in charge of giving out the grain but their brother Joseph? Dressed up as an Egyptian, he's viceroy, second in charge of all of Egypt. So his brothers don't recognize him, but Joseph recognizes them. And he puts them very cleverly, without revealing his identity, puts them to a series of tests to understand whether they're actually sorry for what they did to him all those years ago and whether they have changed. So that is the background to this story. Here they come back again, the brothers, and Joseph finally reveals himself to them. "I am Joseph. I am the brother you sold into slavery." And we can imagine those 10 brothers, or 11 by this time because Benjamin's with them, what they must be thinking. The 10 who had done it, his 10 older brothers, they're stunned. The passage makes clear they're silent. They're speechless. They don't know what to say. And we can imagine what's going through their mind. Oh my goodness. He's going to do to us what we did to them. He's going to have to him. He's going to have us killed. Or he's going to sell us off to slavery. At the very least, he's not going to help us, and he's going to send us home to perish in the famine. But in this moment, what happens? Joseph forgives them. he finds it in his heart to forgive them. It's a wonderful moment of reconciliation. And the sermon could easily end here. Forgive as Joseph forgave. But there's another element in our passage, because Joseph wants to emphasize to his brothers that God's hand has been in all of this. Don't take this too hard, what you did to me, because God has been able to use even that for good. This has, in a sense, been kind of part of God's plan. There is, Joseph insists, another character in this whole story. And it raises the question for us, how does God act in the world? If Joseph sees evidence of God's hand in what has happened, how do we see evidence of God's hand in the world? Does God tightly control his creation so that nothing happens apart from the divine will? That understanding is okay when things are going well, if God's up there pulling all the strings. But when things aren't going well, when people are suffering, that raises unbearable questions about God. Why do good people suffer? How do we understand God's providence in the pediatric cancer ward? Or in the shelters for victims of domestic violence? Or how do we understand God's providence just in the middle of a life that seems not to have added up? Well, Joseph's story actually speaks to these things too. Because picture Joseph down in the bottom of that pit, put there and abandoned by his brothers. Think of Joseph being led, probably attached to a camel by a rope, being led, sold by his brothers into captivity in Egypt. Or think of Joseph languishing in a prison cell, accused of a capital offense. And I should actually, a little sidebar, I should mention that I don't know if they chose it because of the readings, but this is for all of the churches in New Hampshire, repeal the death penalty Sunday. Because the 10 denominations who are part of the New Hampshire Council of Churches can't actually often agree on a great deal, but this is one thing upon which they agree. That the death penalty is morally repugnant because it makes us all complicit in homicide. The death penalty is ineffective as a deterrent to capital crimes. The death penalty postpones justice for the victims' families. And the death penalty is an obscene waste of public money, as the overall cost of a single execution, from start through all the appeals and finally the finish, is $30 million. The death penalty ignores the sanctity of all human life, and it defies the gospel message of Jesus, that violence and hatred are not overcome, conquered, or transformed by more acts of violence, but by the power of mercy. We cannot see that more clearly than in the two stories we have in today's readings. Jesus' words in the gospel and the experience and story of Joseph. From Jesus we hear, love your enemies, turn the other cheek, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Do not judge, forgive. And why? Why, Jesus says, why do you need to do these things? Because that's what God is like. God is kind even to the wicked. Be merciful as your Father is merciful. So that's my bit for the Death Penalty Repeal Sunday. But now back to our story. It's easy to have faith in God's providence, that God cares for us and helps us when things are going well. But think back to when Joseph was in his prison cell. What was the hand of God doing then? Or think forward for the Israelites. Think forward to the 400 years where they will serve as slaves in Egypt. Where is God then? It's hard to have confidence in God's providence when we are in the unspoken, uncharted territory of suffering and experiencing the purposelessness which often goes along with it. And you've heard me say it before, that it's not just suffering that is so difficult to take. It's when suffering feels meaningless. So Joseph's story still speaks to us, because when Joseph says, or the narrator says, that God prospered everything that Joseph did, there's a lot of people that can't identify with that prosperity. But we can all identify with Joseph's experience of being wronged. That's an experience that's universal. And what we discover in the story of Joseph is that forgiveness is crucial to God's providence, to God's care. When Joseph forgives his brothers, he allows God's providence to flow. The way of the world is to use power to pay back those who wronged us. If Joseph had treated his brothers as they had treated him, if he had sold them into slavery themselves or simply sent them home to perish from the famine, God's providence and God's purpose would have been thwarted. Remember God's promise to Abraham that you will be a great nation, that I will give you this land and your progeny will be greater than the stars in the sky. For God's plan and God's providence to happen, Joseph needed to forgive his brothers. God's purposes, God's reconciling movement in the world, because that is always the movement of God, still and always has hinged on forgiveness. The dramatic moment that we heard in today's reading, that poignant moment in Genesis 45, longs to be played out again and again every time someone is wronged. A pope steps into an Italian jail cell and forgives his would-be assassin. A grieving mother walks across a tense courtroom to embrace the man whose drunk driving has snatched away her son's life. A wife forgives her husband. A friend forgives a friend. An enemy forgives an enemy. When reconciliation breaks out in these moments, Joseph's God, our God, lives in a new form. Suddenly the position of the victim has radically changed. In the moment of forgiveness, the wronged one is transformed from a mere victim to being co-creator with God of a brand new world. God's providence requires our forgiveness.
This sermon series and the redchurchdoor.org are brought to you by the Episcopal Church of New Hampshire and is a program of St. Peter's Episcopal Church in New Hampshire. The music in this recording has been supplied by membership through audioblocks.com. You can subscribe to these sermons and the Red Church Door podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts.